I'm going to tell you something I noticed in myself at 53 that I did not expect. Not a discovery from the manuscripts, not something I read in a library, something I noticed in my own life, quietly, over a period of months, that I did not understand until I went looking for it in the texts I had spent 30 years studying. And when I found it in the place I least expected. In a silence, in the chapter where Solomon stops praying. I have been studying King Solomon for most of my adult life. The manuscripts, the archaeology, the convergence of traditions across Judaism, Islam, and African spiritual knowledge. I have read the Testament of Solomon in its original Greek. I have spent months in Ethiopian monasteries, examining manuscripts that have not been photographed, let alone published. I have cross-referenced the Talmud with the Quran, with the Hebrew scriptures on questions that most people in each tradition would not think to ask. I have spent 30 years inside this material, and at 53, I found myself inside the most significant thing Solomon ever wrote, not as a researcher, but as a subject. I want to tell you what I found, and I want to tell you why the man who knew more about spiritual warfare than anyone in human history left behind a warning that was written specifically for the season of life you may be in right now. Ecclesiastes 12, his most personal book, his confession. Let me begin with what actually happens to faith after 60. Not what people say happens, not the theological explanation, what actually happens. At some point in the decades after 60, and it does not arrive all at once, it arrives gradually. In the way that all the most significant things arrive, prayer begins to change in quality. It does not stop. That is the critical thing. It does not stop. The words continue, the practice continues. The habit that was built over decades is not broken, but something beneath the words, the certainty that they are landing somewhere, the felt conviction that God is listening, the thing that made prayer feel like contact rather than repetition, that thing quietly changes. Not absent, not complete, different. And the difference is subtle enough that many people live inside it for years without naming it. They pray, they go to church, they read the scripture, but the certainty that was once underneath all of it, the bedrock assurance that this matters, that the prayer reaches, that God is genuinely present and actively engaged, that certainty has lost some of its former solidity. It happened to me at 53. I am 57 now. I am telling you this from the other side of it. But at 53, I was already a man who had spent 30 years studying Solomon's encounter with the divine. And I recognized what was happening to me only because I had read the chapter that describes it. Ecclesiastes 12, verse 1. Remember your Creator before the evil days come and the years approach when you will say, I find no pleasure in them. I want to show you exactly what that phrase means, because I have read a great deal of commentary on this verse, and most of it, in the mainstream Western tradition, softens it into something gentler than it is. The Hebrew word translated as evil in this verse is ra'ah. This is not the word for hardship or suffering or physical decline. Ra'ah is the same word used throughout the Hebrew scriptures for the evil inclination, the yetzer hara in rabbinic tradition, the internal adversary, the active force of spiritual opposition. Solomon is not warning in Ecclesiastes 12 that old age is unpleasant. He is warning that old age is specifically targeted. The Talmud, Tractate Shabbat, chapters 151 through 152, contains an extraordinary piece of rabbinic interpretation of this passage. Rabbi Shimon ben Halafta reads each phrase in the opening verses of Ecclesiastes 12 as a coded reference to a specific decade of life, beginning at a particular physiological turning point. The evil days do not mean the hard days. They mean the days of spiritual opposition, the days when the adversary moves most actively, not against your body, against your certainty that God is listening. Solomon, the wisest man alive, wrote this as a tactical document, a warning about the specific season when the battle changes character, when it moves from assault to erosion, from crisis to drift. Now I need to take you to the most devastating detail in the entire biblical account of Solomon's life. It is not in Ecclesiastes, it is in 1 Kings chapter 11. Solomon's faith erosion was not an event, it was a process. Listen to how the Hebrew describes it. His wives turned his heart. The word in Hebrew is heta. It does not mean broke. It does not mean destroyed. It does not mean severed. It means bent, deflected, gradually redirected. Like a river that has been diverted so slowly that no single moment of diversion can be identified. The water does not stop flowing. It simply flows in a different direction. By the time 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 9 tells us, the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord God of Israel. Solomon himself may not have noticed the full extent of the drift. The text says his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. Fully, shalem in Hebrew, not absent, not complete, not shalem. And the mechanism was not combat. The mechanism was incremental. The mechanism was time and proximity and comfort, and the slow accumulation of foreign influences inside the household. The enemy did not attack Solomon at midnight with a dramatic confrontation. The enemy moved in with his 700 wives and 300 concubines, and stayed, and worked, slowly, redirecting, bending, over the course of years, until the man who had built the temple of God was burning incense to Chemosh. The rabbinic tradition, in Tractate Sanhedrin chapter 70, addresses this with unusual candor. The sages ask, how could Solomon, who had been granted wisdom surpassing all other men, who had experienced the Shekinah descending into the Holy of Holies at the temple's dedication, who had heard God speak directly to him twice, how could Solomon end where he ended? The answer they arrive at is the one that Solomon himself points to in Ecclesiastes 12. The most dangerous form of spiritual warfare is the one that does not look like warfare. The slow siege, the long drift, the decades of incremental redirection that happen inside a household, inside a comfort, inside a season of life when the greatest battles have already been fought and won, and the believer has settled into what they believe is the security of maturity. Solomon classified this adversary. In the Testament of Solomon, the ancient document I have spent years working with, Chapter 18 catalogues the 36 deacon spirits, a full taxonomy of spiritual adversaries based on the ancient system of the zodiacal deacons. Among these, several are classified not as spirits of acute crisis, but as spirits of chronic low-intensity operation. They do not attack, they accompany. They work through time and repetition. Their victory condition is not collapse, it is drift. The scholarly edition of the Testament of Solomon, McCown's critical edition from 1922, notes specifically that several of these deacon demons are associated with confusion about direction, loss of the sense of divine presence, and the gradual erosion of spiritual certainty. Not mental illness, not physical attack, erosion. The enemy Solomon classified in his manuscripts as the most dangerous was not the demon who arrives in force at midnight. It was the one who has been working quietly for a decade, and this is the adversary Ecclesiastes 12 warns about. Remember your Creator before the evil days come, before the days of the long siege, before the drift becomes the address. I want to tell you what I noticed at 53, because I want to be precise about it. I had not stopped praying. I had not stopped reading. I had not made any dramatic departure from the faith practice I had maintained since my 20s. What had changed was beneath the practice. The quality of certainty underneath the words. Prayer had continued. But at some point, I cannot identify the exact moment, which is itself part of the thing I am describing. The prayer had become more mechanical and less relational. More like maintenance and less like contact. More like a practice I continued, because I had always continued it, and less like a living conversation with a God I was absolutely certain was on the other side of it. The words were correct. The habit was intact. But something had quietly shifted in the conviction that was supposed to be underneath both. And here is what I did not initially understand. I did not initially understand that this was not a theological problem. It was not evidence of doubt or loss of faith in any dramatic sense. It was evidence that I had been under the low-intensity operation of exactly the kind of adversary Solomon catalogued. The one who does not assault. The one who accompanies. The one who works through the decade, not the night. And then, at 53, in the early months of a year when I had more time to sit with my own thoughts than I had had in a long while, I recognized the silence. Because I had read about the silence in the texts. and I understood for the first time what it was. Here is the silence I am referring to. 1 Kings 8 is one of the most powerful prayers in all of Scripture. Solomon stands before the altar. The temple has been built. The ark has been placed in the Holy of Holies. The Shekinah has descended, the visible glory of God, so concentrated that the priests cannot stand to perform their service. And Solomon prays. 44 verses. It is a prayer of extraordinary theological depth, covering every situation that might arise. Drought, famine, defeat in battle, foreign nations who come and pray at the temple, Israel taken into exile. Solomon covers the full spectrum of human need with a systematic completeness that has no parallel in the biblical text. He prays with his whole being. The chapter ends with the nation celebrating for 14 days. God appears to Solomon in 1 Kings 9 and confirms the covenant. And then, 1 Kings 11, the drift, the incremental redirection, the 700 wives, the altars to Chemosh, the heart that is no longer Shalom, and the detail that I cannot stop thinking about. In all of 1 Kings 11, the chapter that describes the collapse of Solomon's spiritual life, there is no recorded prayer, not one. Solomon, who prayed 44 verses at the temple's dedication, who prayed with a precision and a comprehensiveness that encompassed every possible human situation, does not pray in the chapter that describes the most consequential crisis of his life. He does not cry out. He does not return to the altar. He does not speak aloud to the entities who are redirecting him. He is silent. And the silence is not the cause of the drift. The silence is the drift. When the daily conversation stopped, when the living relational prayer became ceremony, and the ceremony became habit, and the habit continued without the certainty beneath it, what was left was form without force, lamp without oil. I recognized the silence, because at 53 I had been living in a quieter version of it. Not 1 Kings 11, not anything that dramatic, but the early stages of the same direction, the prayer continuing, the certainty beneath it, quietly thinning, the form intact, the oil running low. Now I want to show you why Solomon wrote what he wrote. Because this is the thing the mainstream tradition consistently misses about Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is not the testimony of a man observing life from outside. It is the after-action report of a man who lost the battle he was warning about. Every major religious tradition that holds Ecclesiastes as canonical has struggled with this. The Jewish tradition, the Christian tradition, the Islamic tradition that knows Suleiman's trial. All of them have had to account for the most uncomfortable fact in the Solomonic literature. The man who wrote the most wisdom literature in the Hebrew canon was the most prominent biblical example of wisdom's failure. He wrote Proverbs 16, verse 31. Gray hair is a crown of glory. It is gained in a righteous life. The Hebrew word for gained is matzah, to find, to attain through seeking. The crown of righteous old age is not automatic. It must be found, sought, pursued through continuous spiritual practice. Solomon wrote that verse, and then 1 Kings 11 happened. The most explicit biblical promise about aging in faith was written by the man who became the most explicit biblical example of faith lost in old age. Kohelet Rabbah, the rabbinic commentary on Ecclesiastes, acknowledges this tension with unusual directness. It suggests that Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes not as wisdom observed from a position of safety. He wrote it from inside the wreckage, as testimony, as warning. Here is what the long drift looks like from the inside. Here is how it begins. Here is the season of life when the adversary makes his move, not the dramatic assault, but the slow redirect, the incremental bend, the decades of accompaniment that end in a place the believer would never have agreed to arrive at had they seen the destination clearly at the beginning. Remember your Creator before the evil days come, not as poetry, as a tactical instruction, specifically timed, for a specific season, for the season when the long siege is at its most advanced, and for the season when prayer, daily, spoken, relational, specific prayer, is what stands between the form that remains and the force it is supposed to carry. The Islamic tradition understands Solomon's trial at its deepest level. The Quran, chapter 38, verse 34 says, And we did indeed try Solomon, and we placed upon his throne a body, his soul tested in the place of his authority. Tafsir ibn Kathir explains this as the trial of diminishment, not the removal of faith, the diminishment of the capacity that sustained it, the protective shield that had operated automatically through decades of covenant relationship, the daily connection, the living prayer, the open channel, was not destroyed suddenly. It was gradually weakened through the accumulation of what was familiar, through comfort, through a season of life where the greatest tests had apparently been passed and the soul settled into what it believed was the security of established faith. And in that settling, in that comfort, the adversary found the opening. Not with a weapon, with time. Surah Al-Baqarah, chapter 2, verse 102, connects Solomon explicitly to the knowledge of what can oppose spiritual authority, the knowledge of what bends the channel. The Quran frames this not as Solomon's defeat, but as his trial. And the trial of the greatest is always the most specific, not assault, diminishment, the slow weakening of the protective capacity that prayer builds and silence allows to erode. Now I want to tell you about the prayer that was missing, because this is the practical heart of everything I have said. 1 Kings 8, verse 28 through verse 30. In Solomon's great temple dedication prayer, he says this, "Yet give attention to your servant's prayer and his plea for mercy, Lord my God. Hear the cry and the prayer that your servant is praying in your presence this day. May your eyes be open toward this temple night and day, this place of which you said, my name shall be there, so that you will hear the prayer your servant prays toward this place." This is the architecture of Solomon's prayer method. Daily oriented attention, night and day, praying in the presence. The eyes of God kept open toward the place by the act of continuous daily returning. The temple lamps burned every night. Exodus 27, verse 20. Command the Israelites to bring you clear oil of pressed olives for the light, so that the lamps may be kept burning. Not lit once, not lit in crisis. Kept burning, daily, without interruption. Not because God would forget the temple in the dark, but because the act of tending, the daily return to the lamp, the daily pouring of oil, the daily choice to maintain what has been established, is itself what the relationship between the believer and God is made of. Solomon maintained the temple lamps for 34 years, and then he stopped maintaining his own. And 1 Kings 11 describes what happens when the lamp is left to burn without tending. The oil runs low. The light does not go out all at once. It dims, gradually, over years, until the man who built the temple is burning incense to Chemosh, not because he chose to abandon God, because he stopped daily choosing to return. What you do with this is what matters, and I want to give it to you exactly as I found it, not as an academic conclusion, but as the practice that I began at 53 when I recognized the silence in my own life and went looking in the texts for what Solomon had stopped doing. This is the daily faith maintenance practice. It has 4 parts. It is not a crisis prayer. It is a lamp-tending practice. The difference is important. Solomon prayed 44 verses in crisis, at the temple's dedication, in the great public moment, the high point of his spiritual life. The prayer he needed in 1 Kings 11 was not 44 verses. It was the daily prayer that he had apparently stopped praying. The maintenance prayer. The one that keeps the lamp burning between the great moments. Every morning, before anything else enters, before the phone, before the first word to another person, before the pull of the day's demands, speak aloud, not in your mind, aloud. My Creator, I remember you before this day becomes an evil day. I have not forgotten your name. This is Ecclesiastes 12, verse 1, spoken as personal covenant renewal, not recited as a formula, spoken with full consciousness of the season you are in, with full consciousness that you are choosing, in this moment before anything else, the direction of your attention for the day. Solomon's wives turned his heart gradually, because Solomon apparently stopped beginning each day with an explicit renewal of where his heart was pointed. The daily declaration is the counter to the incremental redirect. You cannot be slowly bent in a direction you explicitly name and resist every morning. The second part. Name one specific area where you feel the drift. Solomon's silence in 1 Kings 11 is what makes the drift invisible. He does not name it. He does not speak it aloud. He does not say, "I notice that I have been spending time with forces that are redirecting me, and I am naming that now." He lives silently inside it, and what we live silently inside owns us more completely than what we name aloud. Speak this aloud. I have not prayed about this thing in this long. I am naming it now. It does not need to be elaborate. It needs to be specific and spoken. The specific thing, the specific gap, spoken aloud into the air of the room, not confessed to a congregation, not announced anywhere, spoken aloud to God, specifically, naming the drift rather than living silently inside it. Solomon's silence was not the result of the drift. The silence was the drift. Speaking the specific thing breaks the mechanism. The third part. Speak Proverbs 16 verse 31 aloud over your own life. Gray hair is a crown of glory. I gained it in a righteous life, and I am still gaining it today. Not as a wish, not as a hope, as a declaration of the ongoing condition. The crown is not given once. Solomon's word matzah tells us it must be found, sought, pursued through continuous spiritual practice, not in the past tense. Today. Still gaining today. The most devastating detail about Solomon's life is that he wrote this promise and did not find it himself. He wrote the instruction for aging in faith from inside a trajectory that was heading away from it. When you speak this verse aloud every morning, you are doing what Solomon told you to do, and you are not doing what Solomon himself stopped doing. The fourth part. Pray specifically against the spirit of Kasel. Sahih Bukhari, Hadith number 6367, records the Prophet's morning prayer. O God, I seek refuge in you from anxiety and grief, from incapacity and laziness, from cowardice and miserliness, from being overcome by debt and overpowered by men. The Arabic word translated as laziness is kasal. In the Islamic spiritual tradition, kasal is not ordinary tiredness or physical inertia. It is the spiritual inertia, the specific category of diminishment that causes a believer to continue the forms of faith while the force beneath them quietly drains. It is the deacon-demon category that Solomon catalogued in the Testament of Solomon. The adversary whose victory condition is not collapse but drift. Pray against it by name every morning, not in crisis, in maintenance. O God, I seek refuge in you from the kasal, the spiritual inertia, the drift, that makes my prayer a form without force and my faith a habit without certainty. Renew the oil in the lamp today, not long, not elaborate, specific, daily, spoken aloud. 4 parts, spoken every morning before anything else. This is what Solomon did not do in the years described in 1 Kings 11. This is what the silence cost him, and this is what it costs nothing to begin today. I want to come back to something I said at the beginning. I was 53 when I recognized the silence in myself. I am 57 now. I want to be honest with you about what happened when I found the practice I just described and began to use it. It was not dramatic. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no single morning when the certainty suddenly returned at full force and everything was as it had been at 25. What happened was slower than that and more substantial. The daily declaration each morning, the naming of the specific drift, the speaking of Proverbs 16 verse 31, the prayer against Kasel, did not feel powerful on any individual morning. It felt like tending a lamp, small, deliberate, repeated. The oil poured in a daily quantity that seemed insufficient for the task, and over weeks, over months, the quality beneath the prayer changed. Not all at once, not dramatically. The way of fire changes when wood is added regularly, not in the moment of each addition, but in the cumulative warmth that builds over time. The certainty came back, not at full original force immediately, but the drift stopped. And then, gradually, the direction reversed, not because of 44 verses on one great morning, because of 4 daily spoken declarations before the day started, every morning, without waiting to feel moved, without waiting for the certainty to return before doing the practice that restores the certainty. Tending the lamp, not once in the great moment, daily in the ordinary moments. The way Solomon tended the temple lamps for 34 years before he stopped. The way the monk in Axum burns the incense before dawn every morning of his life, not because the incense changes each morning, because the tending is the relationship. I want to be direct with you now. If you are 60 or 65 or 70, or if you are approaching that season, and you recognize what I have described, if you know the feeling of a prayer practice that continues while something beneath it has quietly changed quality, if you have been living as Solomon lived in 1 Kings 11, in the silence that is itself the drift, this is not evidence of failure. It is not evidence that your faith was never real. It is evidence that you are in exactly the season Solomon warned about, the season the adversary targets specifically, not because you are weak, because you are the oldest believer in your household, and the West African Pentecostal tradition understands something about this that I want to name directly. In the Yoruba and Igbo traditions, there is a recognized category of spiritual attack that targets the elder generation in a family specifically, not to destroy that individual's faith entirely, to use the drift of the elder's prayer life, the thinning of the certainty, the form without force, as an opening into the generations below. The eldest believer in a family is either a spiritual citadel or an open door. When the oldest one who prays is praying with full certainty and daily maintenance, when the lamp is kept burning, the household stands under a covering that extends beyond what any member could secure individually. When the lamp is left to burn without tending, when the oil is not added daily, when the drift goes unnamed, the covering thins, and the generations below feel it without knowing why. Solomon understood this. The nation's spiritual covering was tied to the king's daily covenant renewal. When the king's heart was Shalem, fully devoted, the lamp burning, the nation stood under the protection that generated. When the king's heart was no longer Shalem, the drift unnamed, the daily renewal stopped. The nation's spiritual protection began to fail at its foundation. You are the king in your household, the elder believer, the one who has prayed the longest. The adversary targets your faith after 60 because the prize is not your life. The prize is the open door into the ones who come after you. Let me close with what Solomon was trying to tell us in Ecclesiastes 12. Not the beautiful imagery that generations of commentators have read as poetry about autumn and silver cords and golden bowls. The tactical warning: remember your Creator before the evil days come, before the days of the long siege, before the drift becomes the address. Remember Him actively, daily, specifically, not in the manner of habit, but in the manner of covenant renewal. Before each day becomes an evil day, claim it explicitly. Speak it aloud. My Creator, I remember you before this day becomes an evil day. I have not forgotten your name. Solomon was the wisest man alive. He had more spiritual knowledge than anyone who has ever lived. He built the temple. He housed the ark. He heard God's voice twice. He had the 44-verse prayer in 1 Kings 8, and 1 Kings 11 still happened. Because the battle after a certain season of life is not about whether you can pray. It is about whether you still believe the prayer matters. And that belief is not maintained by the great prayers. It is maintained by the daily ones. The lamp that burns not in the dedication ceremony, but in the ordinary darkness before dawn. The oil poured in a quantity too small to seem significant, each morning, without ceremony, before the day has a chance to become an evil day. Faith is not a fire you light once. It is a lamp you tend it daily. The way Solomon tended the temple lamps for 34 years before he stopped. The way the monk in Axum rises before dawn to burn the incense. Not because the incense is new, because the tending is the vigil. And the vigil is what the lamp requires. You know what you do when a lamp is running low on oil. You do not close the door and wait for it to go out. You pour, this morning, before anything else. My Creator, I remember you, before this day becomes an evil day. I have not forgotten your name. Pour the oil, sleep well tonight, or perhaps don't. Now that you know what Solomon stopped doing, and what it cost him, and what it cost you nothing to begin again.